To be fully human is to become a person through whom life flourishes, a person who cares, who cultivates, who repairs, who brings order without domination, who exercises responsibility without exploitation, a person who understands that authority at its best exists for service rather than control.
We exist not to rule with heavy hands, but to help our life to flourish. Our life to flourish. Our life, the home of meaning, yeah, yeah.
If it's your first time around this neck of the woods, welcome. I am truly glad you're here. This is a space where we explore the deep roots of the ideas that quietly shape our lives. The ideas that shape how we understand ourselves, how we relate to one another, and how we make meaning in our lives. Especially so in those seasons when we find ourselves asking again what it means to be human. And today we arrive at our 5th creation story in this little series, I guess. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're probably saying, wait a second, didn't you say this was the final episode? Well, yes and no. This is our final creation story, but I still have one more reflection for you. Because it's one thing to listen to these stories individually, and it's quite another to step back and look at them together. And that's exactly what we'll do in our final conversation. You've heard me say time and time again that our shared humanity truly matters. Well, as it turns out, when we place our human cosmologies, our creation stories, side by side, there is something beautiful and I think deeply important worth noticing about that shared humanity. But we'll save that for next time. Now, for today's story, this may very well be the most well-known creation narrative in human history. Few stories have shaped the human imagination more deeply than the story of Adam and Eve. Now, this story spread through the spread of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and later through the forces of European colonial expansion. This story traveled across continents, languages, and civilizations. For countless people around the world, this is the story of human beginnings. But strangely enough, it may also be one of the most misunderstood stories we possess. Part of that, I think, comes from the fact that we rarely encounter the story on its own terms. We often approach it through the lenses of doctrine, denominational traditions, or theological systems that already know what they want the text to say. Biblical scholars sometimes call this eisegesis. That is, reading our ideas into the text rather than allowing the text to speak for itself. So today I want to try something a little different. I want us to listen to the story as it is. not as one religious institution or another might prefer it to be, not as a battleground for doctrine, but as one of humanity's oldest reflections on what it means to be human. And right away, we encounter something that surprises many people. There are actually two creation stories sitting side by side in the book of Genesis. The first is the newer priestly account found in Genesis 1. The second is the much older non-priestly story that begins in Genesis 2. The compilers of Genesis preserved both traditions and placed them beside one another. And honestly, by now, that shouldn't surprise us. We have seen exactly the same thing throughout this entire series. The Haudenosaunee have multiple tellings. The Chinese traditions developed over centuries. The Mesopotamian stories exist in numerous forms. Ancient storytelling communities often preserved different versions rather than eliminating them. They allowed multiple voices to remain in conversation with one another. Genesis does the same thing. And since most of us already know these stories, I'll keep the retelling brief and focus our attention on what they might reveal about being human. So, with that, let's dive right in. The first account, and by first I mean Genesis 1, the newer priestly story, begins with mystery. The earth is described as formless and empty, or perhaps more accurately, wild and unorganized. Darkness covers the deep. Waters already exist. The world is not so much created from absolute nothingness as it is ordered and given structure. The Elohim, a grammatically plural Hebrew word often translated simply as God, began separating and organizing light from darkness, the waters above from the waters below, the dry land from the seas. Creation unfolds through a rhythm of ordering and filling. The seas are separated and then filled with living creatures. The skies are established and then filled with birds. The land emerges and then flourishes with life. The pattern is remarkably consistent. First, God makes room. Then God fills that room with life. And finally, humanity arrives. The text tells us that the Elohim created Adam in their image and likeness. Male and female, he created them. Notice that carefully. The Hebrew text does not yet speak of Adam and Eve. It speaks simply of humanity. Adam, made both male and female, and together the Adams, as I like to call them, receive their vocation to care for creation, to bring forth its potential, to participate in its flourishing. Then comes the older story, Genesis 2. This time the creator is Yahweh. The rhythm is different, the details are different. But once again, order emerges from incompleteness. The text tells us that no shrub had yet appeared upon the earth, no plant had yet grown, for there was no rain, and there was no human being to work and care for the land. The world exists, but it has not yet been cultivated, and it has not yet reached its potential. And so Yahweh forms the male Adam from the dust of the ground. The word Adam or Adam itself is connected to Adamah, the earth, the soil, the reddish-brown ground from which humanity comes. The human being is quite literally an earth creature. Yahweh places him within a garden, an enclosure designed to be cultivated and cared for. The human vocation remains the same: caretaking, stewardship, participation in creation. At the center of the garden stands the mysterious tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And as Adam goes about naming the animals, he comes to an important realization. Every creature exists within a corresponding relationship. Each has its own equal, its partner, and yet he stands alone. No corresponding other is found for him. And so Yahweh fashions the woman from Adam's side. And when he sees her, Adam breaks into poetry. This is at last bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. In other words, she is like me. She corresponds to me. She is my equal. The story presents humanity not as isolated individuals, but as beings created for mutual relationship and shared responsibility. Only later in Genesis 3, after the rapture between creator and created, does the woman receive the name Eve, a name connected to life and living. And that, at least in broad strokes, is how the story arrived at us. Now, let me share a couple of things that stand out to me in these stories. And the first is this: human beings are presented as caretakers, not as conquerors. Both Genesis 1 and 2 agree on this point. Humanity is given responsibility for the world, responsibility to cultivate it, to tend it, to bring forth its goodness and potential. Now, I know that some translations use words like subdue and have dominion, and throughout history, those words have often been interpreted through the lens of conquest, exploitation, and human superiority. But if the stories themselves are allowed to speak at their own terms, a different picture emerges. The human being in Genesis 2 is placed in the garden to work it and keep it, to serve it, to care for it. The earth is not presented as an enemy to be conquered, but as a gift to be cultivated. And this remains one of the great struggles of our own age. We live in a world shaped by consumerism, a world that often asks not how do we care for the earth, but rather, what more can I extract from it? Yet, these ancient storytellers seem to invite us into a different rhythm altogether. A rhythm of stewardship, gratitude, and caretaking. Humanity's first vocation was never conquest, it was care. The second thing that stands out is the relationship between male and female. The first story tells us that humanity is created in the image of God, male and female together. In fact, the Hebrew text simply speaks of Adam or Adam, which is humanity itself. The distinctions and names come later. And in the second story, the woman is not created as a lesser being or a secondary creature. She is the corresponding other, the equal partner that the man himself immediately recognizes as one like himself. The vision here is one of mutuality, one of shared humanity, shared responsibility. And yet, this remains another struggle in our world. Many communities that regard these stories as authoritative continue to wrestle with questions of equality, leadership, dignity, and partnership between men and women. And this brings us back to something I mentioned at the beginning. Human beings do not merely read texts, we also read ourselves into them. Our assumptions, our traditions, our fears, and even our social arrangements. Sometimes what we call interpretation is simply our own worldview speaking with biblical language. The challenge then is to allow the story to speak on its own terms, even when it unsettles what we have always assumed. The third thing that stands out is that creation itself is collaborative work. The transcendent does not do everything alone. Human beings are invited into the process. In Genesis 1, humanity is entrusted with feeling and caring for the world. In Genesis 2, Adam is given the task of cultivating the garden and naming the animals. The work of creation continues through human participation. God brings order. Humanity is called to extend that order into the world. God creates beauty. Human beings are invited to preserve and cultivate it. The relationship is not one of passive spectatorship. It is one of participation, of shared vocation. And perhaps that is one of the enduring spiritual lessons of these ancient texts. Human flourish happens when the transcendent and the human work towards the same ends: life, beauty, justice, and community. And the final thing that stands out is the idea of humanity as image bearers. Now, entire libraries have been written about what the image of God means. But at the very least, these stories seem to suggest that human beings possess a unique responsibility within creation. We are entrusted with bringing order where there is disorder, cultivating beauty where there is neglect, creating communities where there is isolation, and helping life to flourish. The image of God is not merely a status to possess, it is a vocation to live, a calling to participate in the ongoing work of creation itself. And I am convinced our world desperately needs that vision today, because we often measure greatness by what we consume, what we own, what we accumulate. But Genesis offers another measure entirely. To be fully human is to become a person through whom life flourishes. A person who cares, who cultivates, who repairs, who brings order without domination, who exercises responsibility without exploitation. A person who understands that authority at its best exists for service rather than control. And maybe that is the enduring invitation these ancient stories still place before us. To ask ourselves, I guess, what kind of image are we reflecting into the world? One that consumes or one that creates? One that dominates or one that nurtures? One that takes or one that helps life to flourish? Because I think becoming fully human has never been about standing above creation. It has always been about learning how to care for it together. Now, before we call it a day, I should mention that this reflection first appeared on Patreon before making its way here. In fact, that's where all our reflections begin their journey. Patreon is also home to our extended conversations, where we sit with these ideas a little longer and explore them a little deeper. So, if you'd like to support the work we do here, or simply continue the conversation, I'd love to meet you there. Until next time, when we bring this series to its conclusion, I want to thank you for being here, because learning what it means to be human together truly, truly matters.
We exist not to rule with heavy hands, but to help our life to flourish. The home of meaning,